Hi there, this is Trevor Butler, and this is my restoration project on the succession crisis of 1844 and how it's affected the church today. There were four main players in the succession crisis, including James Strang, Joseph Smith III, Sidney Rigdon, and Brigham Young. And we'll go through each one in detail and their contribution to the succession crisis. And we'll start with James Strang. He was personally baptized by Joseph Smith only a couple months before Joseph Smith's martyrdom. He was a lawyer and former Baptist minister, so he was very articulate and intelligent, and he ultimately had about 12,000 followers, including many notable ones like the Whitmers, Martin Harris, and almost the entire Smith family. And being not so well known, many wonder as to how he ended up with so many followers, and this is mainly due to the fact that he claimed to have received a letter from Joseph Smith 9 days prior to Joseph Smith's martyrdom that named James Strang as the next successor to the church, and he to also plant a stake of Zion in Voree, Wisconsin, as you can see here. And to further that claim, in Voree, Wisconsin, he claimed to have found plates, the Raha Menchau plates, and translated them much like Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. And unlike those, where they were Reformed Egyptian, which was a recognizable language, these were in an unrecognizable language and were the story of only one person in the ancient Americas. And they were likely forgeries, and the letter was definitely a forgery, as they later found out. Eventually, James Strang will settle in an area of Beaver Island, and as you can see here in North Michigan in the Great Lakes, and he'll crown himself king, and also write many other commandments as well, including the Book of the Law of the Lord, as you can see here, and it was printed by the command of the king, so he was already king at this time, at the royal press. And this Book of the Law of the Lord was very controversial because originally he rejected polygamy, unlike Brigham Young and the saints after Joseph Smith, who went west. But this Book of the Law of the Lord introduced polygamy to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, no hyphen, and he ultimately had 5 wives by the end of before his death. And this caused many problems for him, including many of his other distinctive teachings and practices, that there was one God only, and that was the Father, so he was a monotheist. And he believed that Jesus Christ was a man and not a God. And in other words, that the Father adopted Jesus Christ as the only perfect man, but he was not the Son of God. And that also made progression to godhood as impossible, so we could not become gods. And he also believed that there was a seventh-day Sabbath, so much like the tradition of the Jews, starting on Saturday and instead of Sunday. And he rejected plural marriage, like I said earlier, and then later had 5 wives, which led to many problems for him. And he also allowed women to hold the priesthood, offices of priest and teacher. And once again, he crowned himself king in 1850. And this was due to the fact that he believed that all prophets and seers and revelators before him basically gave him the keys, or held the keys from the beginning of time, of kingship. And he also believed, including many of his followers, that Joseph Smith himself crowned himself king in secret, and that was a justification for him crowning himself king. And many of these teachings led to serious problems, and he had many enemies. And Thomas Bedford and Alexander Wentworth were a couple of them who planned because they were bitter, planned his assassination. And Thomas Bedford had been flogged for adultery on Strang's orders, and Wentworth believed that Strang was blackmailing the saints into paying his debts. And so they procured pistols and prepared to meet Strang in the bay here. This is Beaver Island, as you can see. And St. James, the capital of Beaver Island, was right next to this harbor. And James Strang didn't believe the reports of possible assassination of him. And so he didn't have a bodyguard, and so it made him an easy target for Bedford and Wentworth in the harbor of St. James, where, in full view of the USS Michigan, he was shot 3 times in the back. One grazed his head, one hit him in the spine, paralyzing him to where he lived for about 3 weeks still, even after being shot at around 7 p.m. on June 16th, 1856. He was only 43 years old, and it left the Saints leaderless because he didn't name a successor. This led to a call for a new organization in the church, where many of the Latter-day Saints, once again, no hyphen, as you can see here, that visited Joseph Smith III and asked him to take up Joseph Smith, his father's mantle, but he kept on replying that he would only do it if he were inspired by God to do so. And eventually, he was appointed president of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on April 6, 1860, after about 4 years after James Strang's death. And this occurred in Amboy, Illinois, and upon being appointed, he stated as to why he was accepting this position. For some time past, I have received manifestations pointing to the position which I am about to assume, and I have come in obedience to a power not my own, and shall be dictated by the power that sent me. And this was a very important moment for the reorganized church. And also, in 1981, our church exchanged with the RLDS Church several documents for a forged letter, but that they didn't know it was forged at the time, that claimed that Joseph Smith III had received a blessing from his father, ordaining him to be the successor to the presidency. And in bold here, it kind of reads out that he'll be a successor to the presidency of the high priesthood, a seer, revelator, and prophet unto the church, which appointment belonged to him by blessing and also by right. And once again, it was found to be a forgery, but in 1981, this was a big deal, with it being signed by Joseph Smith, and it caused many people from our church to leave because they didn't know what to think. And so it's just kind of a lesson that if you don't know, it's just kind of a lesson to everyone that if you don't know, as to if there's something that you don't understand, then wait it out before you draw any conclusions, because it might turn out to be something that it's not. Something that was right about the blessing, though, is that his days shall be lengthened upon the earth. And that was very much true for Joseph Smith III, because he lived for about 50 years as president, but he himself, of his own volition, never said that he was ordained by his father to be president of the church. As you can see here, in a quote by Gordon B. Hinckley in the 1981 General Conference, as he was explaining the context of this blessing that was found to be forged later. It's in a U.S. Circuit Court in Kansas City. He said that he was not ordained by his father as his successor, but he was blessed by him and designated, well, in a sense, chosen. So he was not ordained to be the next president of the church and receive keys. So this brings us to the conflict between Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young. Before we go into that, though, we need a little bit of context as to what was going on before Joseph Smith's martyrdom. In the winter of 1843 to 1844, the apostles, the 12, and would often meet with Joseph Smith in the upper room of the red brick store to discuss things. And in this particular winter, Joseph Smith, no doubt sensing his impending death, prepared the 12 for his departure. And several of those apostles described those days, saying, with Wilford Woodruff here, saying that Joseph said to them many times that I have sealed upon my head every key, every power, every principle of life and salvation that God has ever given to any man who ever lived upon the face of the earth. And he said again, I have sealed upon your heads every key, every power, every principle which the Lord has sealed upon my head. And then he gave him a charge. The burden of the kingdom now rests upon your shoulders, meaning that they were left to the affairs of the church and as the leaders of the church. And Parley P. Pratt and Joseph Smith also said similar things where they quoted Joseph Smith saying that if they kill me, meaning Joseph, the 12 would have all the keys needed to direct the church. And there's also some context as to Sidney Rigdon's situation. Several scholars have debated that he might have had actually a manic depressive illness that grew more serious with age, and it was so severe that by the time he settled in Nauvoo, there were times he couldn't function. And the 1843 General Conference, Joseph Smith actually suggested that he should step down and also probably question his loyalty. And he had reason to. Sidney Rigdon actually received a revelation to not leave Nauvoo and settle in the eastern lands, but in D&C 124, 108, and 109, saying, let him not remove his family into the eastern lands, but seek to find safety and refuge in Nauvoo. But Sidney Rigdon moved, contrary to revelation, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a self-inflicted exile. And then Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith were both martyred on June 27th, 1844, and a deep gloom settled upon the saints upon learning about this. And many of the 12 started to make it back just a few days after hearing about the martyrdom, including Sidney Rigdon, where on August 3rd, about a month after, he came back with the expectation of taking over the church, because not too many of the saints knew that Joseph Smith had lost faith in his first counselor. And on August 4th, he also sermonized to several of the huge gathering of the saints, saying that he was to be a guardian in place of Joseph Smith, and that he was the identical man that the ancient prophets had sung about, as quoted in Isaiah. And so he was not to be the prophet, but he was to be a guardian to the church in place of Joseph, because no one could, in his mind, could replace Joseph Smith. And there was actually supposed to be a meeting, and he was almost appointed on this day, on August 4th, but several of the apostles convinced him to wait a little bit for the rest of the 12 to come back. And on August 6th, 1844, Brigham Young and 4 of the apostles arrived in Nauvoo from the east on the steamboat St. Crux, a very ironic and relevant name for this situation. And upon their arrival, many of them met in John Taylor's home, and that's shown in the back here, where unfortunately they didn't leave a record of the issues discussed, but what was likely discussed were 4 or 5 possible successors to Smith, including Sidney Rigdon and Young, and William Marks, Samuel Smith, and maybe another one of the Smith brothers. And this was no doubt a very important meeting, and it led up to one of the most important dates in the church, August 8th, 1844, where a meeting was held to debate the authenticity of the keys to the 12 or to Sidney Rigdon. And Sidney Rigdon started first at about 10 a.m. and spoke for about an hour and a half, and he actually had to move to another wagon box because the wind was so strong and people couldn't hear him. But many of the saints described his speech as uninspiring. However, Orson Hyde, a longtime Rigdon critic, said that his claims were with all the eloquence and power that he had master of. Sidney Rigdon was not a bad speaker. He was a former Baptist minister before his conversion, and so he knew how to speak in front of a crowd. But the likely thing is that Brigham Young just had a more strong and inspiring spirit that day, where he was described to have been transfigured before the people as he was speaking, and many testified that it was Joseph Smith personified, and that it was also his voice as he spoke. And so he was transfigured before the people to be Joseph Smith, and this inspired many of them to believe that he had received the mantle of prophet, and the keys were received to Brigham Young from Joseph Smith. And right after his speech, he asked the saints if they wanted to sustain the 12 as the first presidency of the people, and all hands went up. And then he asked if any were to the contrary, and no hands went up. And that is very, very interesting and important, because Sidney did have many followers, but after that speech, no hands went up in favor of Sidney Rigdon, and it was unanimous that the 12 and Brigham Young were to be the presidency of the church. And that is how the church is run today. And just to end here, James E. Faust in the 1994 General Conference described that the senior apostle automatically becomes the presiding officer of the church. There's no mystery about it. And the president is not elected, but he has to be sustained both by the brethren of the council and by the members of the church. And I am grateful that there is still order as to how keys have been transferred from Brigham Young all the way up to Thomas S. Monson, our prophet today. And I have learned so much from this project, and I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet, Brigham Young was the rightful successor to the church, and that we have a prophet today, even Thomas S. Monson. And thank you so much for listening, and I hope this has been really informative. Thanks so much.